Balustrades are often seen as tricky to draw, and I think it's because they're often drawn like this. Each individual baluster is given a wobbly silhouette, none of which match up or line up, because that's virtually impossible to do. What I like to do when I have balustrades is something more like this, and I'm aiming to capture the effect of the balusters, not to draw them in detail or exactly as they might be in life. They're often a fairly peripheral part of the scene. But I do the gaps between the balusters first because they're always going to be the same width, and I do them as a negative space, and then I try and create the effect of the, if you like, the indentations where the balusters go in and out, but because they line up right the way along, I do them right the way along. And again, I'm doing them by negative space. So I'm actually, if you like, putting in darkness where there are no balusters to thin where they are at that point. And I find doing horizontal lines helps to even out any wobbliness of my gaps, putting those gaps in. So I find this a great way to get the effect of a balustrade. Next, it's a tip about when drawing domes. Now, often when we look at a dome side on, from some distance away, the top of the drum, the cylinder that the dome sits on, is a straight line, and we often have these ribs that come out from the top of the dome, and sometimes there's a little lantern that sits on top. However, when we're closer to the dome and when we look at it, the top of the drum has a curve to it, such as this. That creates a very important difference, which is often ignored when the ribs are drawn. And the difference is because the very top of the dome, where the ribs meet, can't be seen. It's actually rolling around the part of the dome that's out of view. If you like, the center of the dome, and therefore where the ribs join, is more like here. So we need to leave a gap between the ribs at the top of the dome. Very important detail that's often overlooked. Next tip, third tip, is to do with when we have a building and this box is going to rep the building with some sort of foliage, trees behind it. Perhaps they're close, perhaps they're far away. Often the general effect is such as this. However, it's a lost opportunity, I think, to create a real sense of visual drama by having a much stronger contrast, by going much darker with the values we create for these trees or bushes or whatever's further back. But also, by increasing the contrast, it does make the building seem to jump forward a bit. It really pops it forward, which is usually a very helpful thing to do. The next tip is when we draw flowers, so often we end up with this cartoon effect from drawing an ellipse with petals that join all the way around. In fact, the center of most flowers is a disc that has depth, and often the center of the disc actually rounds up in a mound. And it very seldom is what you would draw a straight line for. More often, there's a whole lot of little stamens creating a sort of a fuzzy texture. The other thing is that the petals don't usually join in a seamless straight line. Another tip that I'd like to do when I draw flowers is, because we're usually seeing them at an angle, I like to put dots at each end and each top and bottom in a cross shape that indicates how far the petals approximately are going to go. And that helps me even the petals all the way around and create this perspective view where the flower is lying quite flat to the plane of my vision. I'm actually looking at it more straight on than down on top. Whereas the more cartoon-like flower above, it's really hard to tell how we're looking at it. And the petals don't necessarily sit flat. They often twist as they move around, and they're also not always very even. There are often overlapping petals and petals that sit a little further apart from each other. And again, we can see something of the depth of the flower, particularly now coming down to where the stem comes out. And let's put a few of those stamens on. Far more realistic petal flower. The next ink drawing technique tip is to do with when we have wrought iron balcony rails. So here's a quick, just made up on the spot balcony rail. So it's not particularly beautiful, but it will suit the purpose. So I'm just drawing it at the moment as if we're looking at it straight on. But this technique is when in fact we're not looking at the rail straight on. And what I often see when I look at railings such as this, we're still just getting a few marks, a few squiggles to have a sense of how it's meant to look, because that will make the actual point of this make more sense, help me to illustrate the point better. So it's when we're now looking at the rail from an angle such as this, and what I find is that the foreshortening's not done. If you look at this, that center element is really in the center of the width, and the left and the right of center elements are really the same size. They might have been squeezed or shrunk vertically, but horizontally they've been left the same. And that's not, I'll just add a few details there, and that's not the effect we want, and that doesn't create a sense of realism. Instead, what we need to do is apply the rules of foreshortening to the decoration on the railing. And you can see how I use the diagonals to give myself a sense of where is the center, because that center decorative circle needs to sit on that, which means the left-hand side element has a lot less space to be narrowed into than the right-hand element. So it's not just doors and windows on a surface moving away from us that is foreshortened, but it's decorative elements, even ones that we can see through on a wrought iron railing. We also have to approximately foreshorten as well as angle those decorative elements. This next technique tip is when we have something like this. It may be a tower, it may just be a fancy finial on the top of a post. And what ends up is that it ends up being drawn like this. And I can tell it's drawn like this because this is how the drawings look. Rather, I find it's far more effective to draw the segments and to stack them. Now, the challenge here is to stack them and to be aware of the center line. I realized just then I didn't take that bit out enough to the right. But to be focused on the center line and to stack piece after piece. These are often produced by lathe work, and so many fine shapes are easily produced. And if we simplify them too much or don't draw them as they are, we can really lose something of the interest, of the appeal. And again, make sure we center any top. A far more effective way to draw that decorative finial. This next technique tip is when we have a hedge. Hedges are often associated with grand architecture, but also on a domestic scale. And the important thing I find with a hedge is to remember the fact that the top is flat and squared off, which means it often catches the light. And so what I find very helpful to maintain the sense of a hedge is to have a thin strip of light, if you like, and that's created by the white paper. And below that, to have some hatching that represents the side of the hedge. Now, whether that's the colour or whether the dark green or whether that's the shaded side, it doesn't really matter. Notice also, though, that the top of the hedge is not a straight line or a continuous line, but some jagged marks to indicate the leaf effect. And I've just done this to stick a shrub or a small tree or a bush or something on the other side of the hedge, just to see the importance of making sure we preserve that gap. Very effective and fast way to create a nice hedge effect. Now, this next tip is when we draw bare tree trunks and branches. So often they're drawn like this, and again, from how they look, it's clear that that's how they're drawn. But we end up with, I don't know, like an aerial view of a river or something that doesn't really look very natural. I find it makes far more sense and gets a better effect to start at the top, to start at the very small branches, and then work my way down to the ground. And I'm not so fussed to join everything up exactly and precisely, because the imprecision lets me draw the effect, I think, more continuously. And remember that some of the branches come directly towards us, and therefore we have masses of fine branches that actually go across the center of the branch canopy as well as at the ends. And by coming down, I can also control the direction and the thickness of the branches as they lead into the trunk and into the ground far more accurately. Because I'm not being exact, I can get away now with a lot of imprecision and, ironically, a more realistic look to my bare trees. Now, when we have a civic building, we often have lettering or writing on it, and that's often a problem, and I know it's a problem because it often ends up looking something like this, and let's face it, we've all been there, we all know that feeling. But when we draw directly in ink, that's a problem. What I do is I count all the letters and I count the gaps as letters. I find the halfway mark, which in this case is between the T and the O, allowing for the gaps as being letters, and then I find the halfway point, maybe it's there, and so now I do what's on the right hand side because that works better for me, and if that fits, now I have a sense of the size letters to go backwards. And so I all the time try to imagine, though, the letters I still have to write and what size it needs to be. I find this a far more accurate way of not having it look like I've run out of space. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Please hit that like button for me and let me know in the comments whether you find these technique tip videos helpful. And if you missed my last video, it was my original 10 tips. This final one is when we draw a building in perspective, I so often see the angles such as this. They're parallel to each other. Once I have the first diagonal line, I do all the other ones at the same angle. And it looks kind of right, but not really right. Instead, I need to remember the fan shape. I need to remember that as the angled lines go up above eye level, they increase in angle. And they increase at whatever angle they need to increase, so that if you were to join them all together, they would all meet up in the same spot. It's not just that the angle increases, they have to increase in the same rate. And I realized I didn't do a great job there with that, so I just made a few adjustments. But this is the effect we should be after. Every angle going higher being angled more than the one below it. Look, I hope you're finding these helpful and use them to have fun when you draw. Bye.